Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see your bright and shining faces this morning
Morning.
at Online Home Church. Good morning, Richard. Thanks so much for joining us today from wherever you are around the nation. It's great to see you as we celebrate the Feast of St. Luke today, whose feast day was last week, Tuesday or Wednesday of last week. And so our gospel lesson is a great place to start. Luke tells us this morning that Jesus told a parable to those who are around them. And the purpose of that parable is humility, to teach a lesson of humility, that those who exalt themselves should be humbled. And more importantly, those who are humble will be exalted. You see, that's a theme of the Gospels. We see it in the Beatitudes. We see it in the Sermon on the Mount and in various messages that Jesus gave to us. Those who hold themselves up, hold themselves up will ultimately be humbled. We have to rely on God to hold us up, and we will be exalted. You can picture the scene. They're there in the temple, and the Pharisees, who are always giving Jesus a hard time. The Pharisee in this parable is praying to God, Lord, thank you. Thank you so much for letting me be me and not be like that guy. And points over to the poor sinner in the corner who's a tax collector. You know, the tax collectors were reviled in this day and age because Jerusalem and the people of Israel were under the thumb of the Empire of Rome. Anybody from that community who then went to work for the emperor was a turncoat and a traitor. And those folks were just absolutely shunned in the society at the time. And so then we kind of move the scene over to the tax collector, who's so humble, he won't even look up. Hat in hand, as we say in modern times, hat in hand, and bowed down before the Lord. And Jesus says, it's that guy, the tax collector, who everyone reviles in that society and at that time. It's that one who will be exalted because he's humble before God. It's a great gospel lesson to talk about today as we celebrate the feast of St. Luke, the Evangelist. Not only is this a story that he wrote, this parable that he put down for us to be talking about and learning lessons from 2,000 years later, but he in particular and his humility are a lesson to us even now. You see, Luke was a learned man. He was well educated. Not only did he write these parables down in Greek, but they're some of the most well-written scriptural verses in the entire Bible. The way that he organized his story, the way that he put together the Gospel of Luke, and then later the second volume, Acts of the Apostles, showed that not only was he well organized and meticulous, but that he was also a fantastic writer. But where did he come up with this ability to write? The Christian tradition and Paul's letters to various Christian churches at the time describe Luke as a physician. Who knows what that means? It's not what it means in modern times, where he went to undergrad med school and then had a residency. That's for sure. But we know that not only did Paul refer to Luke as a physician, that at various times between the references in Acts of the Apostles and the way that Paul was writing folks in early Christian churches, including Timothy, like Roy read for us earlier today, that Paul was not just a physician, he was Paul's physician. And Paul, who tended to get into scraps and frankly, get the tar knocked out of him in every town he visited, Luke was busy taking care of Paul up until the very end. There's a reference in Acts of the Apostles where Luke describes being in prison with Paul in Rome. And that's, of course, where Paul met a martyr's death. And Christian tradition is that Luke met the same fate, although later in time and probably somewhere in Syria. But the reason I mention Luke's humility is that when you look at the entire body of work of the New Testament and the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, John, and the one written by Luke, as well as Acts and all of the letters that Paul and other folks wrote that comprise the New Testament, and then finally, of course, the book of Revelation, likely written by John too. 25% of that, a full quarter of the entire New Testament, was written by this one man, Luke. And yet we hear nothing in the way that we read the Gospel of Luke, as we've been doing all this year from lectionary. We hear nothing of him boasting, nothing of him saying, I'm putting things down in in writing in Greek that will ultimately be read by the entire globe in as many languages as exist on our island home, planet Earth, in as many ways as you can tell the story. People will read me for generations. There's none of that. In fact, there are very few references that Luke makes to himself. The way that we put together that he is a physician, that he is Paul's physician, and that he was a learned man are all just kind of circumstantial. Luke very, very infrequently refers to himself, and when he does, it's in the context of serving with Paul. And sometimes Paul refers to Luke as a co-worker. And so the humility is absolutely a part of this for such an important author in the telling of the good news. But that's why we celebrate this feast day this past week, everybody. That's why we celebrate this feast day, not as St. Luke the physician or St. Luke the historian. We celebrate St. Luke the evangelist. You see, Christian tradition for about the first 1900 years is that Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles as a second volume. But somewhere around 1900s, as biblical scholarship really became more prominent, more widespread, and more diverse, people began criticizing Luke's role as a historian. And so the big knock on him in the last 50 years or so has been that he got the date of a rebellion wrong in his telling of the story in the Gospel of Luke. And therefore, as a historian, for many biblical scholars, his credibility has been undermined. Luke Timothy Johnson, who's a Catholic, I think, priest, now Episcopal priest, and serves at Candler School of Theology, where I attended. Luke Timothy Johnson has written extensively about Luke and claimed he's not only a great historian in terms of the overall Christian church, but one of the greatest historians ever, up there with Eusebius and Thucydides, right, the ancient Greek historian. But there are a lot of folks who say because he got this rebellion in the wrong order, that his role as a historian is not as credible as it used to be. I say it doesn't matter. We're celebrating the feast of St. Luke the Evangelist, and the fact that he wrote such a detailed history, not only of the early Christian church in Acts, but a detailed history of the life of Jesus and Jesus's ancestry, right? Part of the early parts of the Gospel of Luke are Luke taking the great pain to go from Jesus to Joseph and on back all the way to King David, and then on further. That his role as a historian is simply for the purpose of spreading the good news. And that's what evangelist means, someone who tells the story of the good news, that the kingdom of heaven is here, and that the kingdom of heaven is in the form of God made man through his son, Jesus. Luke does a fantastic job of that, regardless of the historical inaccuracies in his story. And furthermore, died for it. One of the things we see all the time when we look at iconic pictures or drawings or artwork that depict the authors of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all have a symbol of one sort. Luke's in particular calls to me because he is the winged ox or the winged bull. My nickname in college was Ox, and so I have a particular affinity for the Gospel of Luke. Not only is it my favorite one to read because it's well set out and organized, as I tend to write, but because Luke is associated with this animal. But why? Why, when we see John affiliated with the eagle and Mark affiliated with the lion and Matthew affiliated with the lamb, why do we see Luke with a bull or an ox? Well, the answer is in ancient times, those bulls were sacrificed in the temple, and they were used, the ox in particular was used for field work, and day after day, year after year, plowed the ground and helped the people in ancient times do their work. And so the bull or the ox is a symbol of strength and service and sacrifice. And this ultimately is what Luke's ministry stood for, and the reason that we celebrate him 2,000 years after he was martyred. Strength and service and sacrifice. And I would throw in, given our lesson today, humility. So as we look at the life of St. Luke and celebrate him this morning, please give some thought as to how you can be exalted by God through your own humility, how you can take the opportunity to look at your neighbor who you say, man, I am so glad I'm not like that person. And then check yourself and say, you know what, that's exactly what the Pharisee did. How can I reach out to that person to spread the good news? That is, after all, the legacy of St. Luke the Evangelist. Amen.
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 And now, with Christians around the world and across time, let's say together the Nicene Creed.